Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our weekly webinar series that occurs here on our Facebook page every Friday at noon. My name is Brianna. I'm a Sustainable Transportation Vermont intern, and I'm so excited to introduce our speaker today, who is Carl Fowler. Carl is the former vice chair of the Rail Passengers Association and a member of the Vermont Rail Advisory Council. And today he will review the history and evolution of rail passenger service in Vermont and northern New England. So I'm going to bring Carl up and hello, Carl.
Hello, indeed.
How are you?
Good early afternoon.
Good early afternoon. I gave a very brief introduction for you, so I was just wondering if you could go a little bit more in depth before we start your presentation.
I'm a lucky man. I got to spend basically almost my entire professional career doing what I loved. I got to go everywhere in the world I ever wanted to go, and somebody else paid for it because I ran a travel business that operated tours by train all over the world. And in conjunction with that, I was, of course, very actively involved in advocating for the preservation and improvement of passenger rail in the United States. I'm a primeval member of what was then the National Association of Railroad Passengers. I ran Rail Travel Center, Rail Travel Adventures, as I mentioned, from 1983 to 2017, and I continue to work on the cause thereafter. And I've served on the Vermont Rail Advisory Council for now almost 20 years. This does not manage rail for the state, but it helps advise the Vermont Agency of Transportation on its rail program. And we are unique in Vermont in being the smallest state in the country to actively support multiple Amtrak routes. And that's sort of the story of today's program. How did we get there? What do we hope for their future? So with that, we can share the program and have I think, an interesting visit. So as I mentioned, Vermont is unique in sustaining 2 Amtrak passenger trains. And it's a lesson in the value of regional passenger rail. We rose, we fell, we rose again, and now we're in suspension. But the story is remarkable. There was an exceptional network of multiple routes and multiple ways to get around northern New England by rail if you were to look at a map of the rail system just after World War II. Much like the airlines, the railroads operated multiple hubs, and there were typically daily services to Boston, New York, from Montreal, multiple routes. You could come down the Central Vermont Railway, you could come down the Rutland Railroad, you could come down the Boston and Maine. And there were multiple hubs at which trains interconnected with each other. This is a picture of a Boston and Maine train at the long-lost station in Greenfield, Mass. The new stop is actually on the other side of the tracks from what we're seeing here. So these are the multiple hubs. Again, just after World War II, we could have made connections at Springfield, Greenfield, Bellows Falls, White River Junction, Wells River, and Rutland. And on all of these routes, there were both day and night trains. And perhaps more consequentially, it was possible to connect between the various routes. And so, for example, if you were coming up from Boston and you were on a train that was heading for Montreal via Newport, but you really needed to get to Burlington, you could connect at White River Junction across the platform and go on to Burlington. This extraordinary system can be sort of echoed in just this one page out of a Boston and Maine Railroad timetable. And it takes a moment to look at this, but this illustrates going from the Washington, D.C. area up to Montreal over the primary Boston and Maine Central Vermont combined route, which hosted a day train called the Ambassador and a night train called the Washingtonian southbound and the Montrealer northbound. But the parallel column there showed the same services connecting to the Canadian Pacific network at White River Junction. So again, we have these multiple hubs. The first to go out, my program is going to torment me here a little bit. The first one that we lost was the Rutland Railroad. The Rutland was the weakest of the partners running between Boston and Montreal, but it had actually what may arguably have been the most important route, despite its failure early on. After World War II, the Rutland was very shaky financially, and by 1953, they were tottering. In the spring of 1953, the staff of the Rutland Railroad went on strike, insisting that the Rutland provide the National Railway wage settlement, even though the Rutland claimed it could not afford to do so. And in June of 1953, the Rutland's management took advantage of that strike to summarily cancel all of their passenger trains, even though, in fact, they actually lacked proper permission to do so. And surprisingly, they got away with it. A very unusual incident in those days. In the 1950s and 60s, if a railway wanted to discontinue its passenger train services, if they crossed a state line, they had to get permission from the Interstate Commerce Commission. If they stayed entirely within a state, they had to get permission from the state regulatory agency. But the Rutland got away with it regardless. Now, I want you to look on this map of the Rutland system just for a moment, and if you look up sort of towards the top center, you'll see Burlington up to Arlberg, and then straight north through Rouse's Point into Canada, and the line seems to disappear. This was a very significant piece of railroad, which was actually the last railway line to be completed in the state of Vermont, probably engineered to a higher standard than any other, and the first major piece of railway in Vermont to go completely. It was the remarkable island line of the Rutland Railroad, which had a 3.5-mile long causeway across Lake Champlain at Colchester, ending up on South Hero Island, which gave it an almost bullet straight route up to Montreal. Sadly, the Rutland's passenger service was only the first loss of service on the Rutland. In 1960, the Rutland's employees struck again, basically over the same issues, and this time the Rutland liquidated itself. The state of Vermont, remarkably, purchased the Rutland Railroad system, something no other state had ever done before, but did not want to maintain the trestles on the island line over Lake Champlain. Freight could still get to Montreal by going from Burlington to Essex Junction on a branch line of the central Vermont, and the state chose to allow that to be the route that traffic from south of Burlington would use to get to Montreal, and abandoned the remarkable island line. And sort of make a bookmark in your mind on that point, because it'll come back. You can see this drawbridge on the left here has actually had to be hand cranked open when a large boat came through. And that was its Achilles heel. The state didn't want to spend the money to motorize the drawbridges. The right-hand side is the status today. It is, of course, a biking and hiking trail, and a ferry runs across that short gap, only about 250 feet wide, but a ferry runs in summers to bridge the gap for bicyclists and walkers. The Central Vermont was the dominant player in the New York-Montreal market through Vermont. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it ran a day train called the Ambassador and an overnight service called the Montrealer in the northbound direction, Washingtonian southbound. And these were serious trains. The day train, the Ambassador, at least until the mid-1950s, primarily actually ran to Boston with connections at White River Junction for New York. It generally carried comfortable daylight coaches with reclining seats, something called a parlor car, which was individual chairs like an armchair, with a small buffet and dining area at one end, which the Pullman Company typically ran. They called them broiler buffet parlor cars. After about 1955-56, the Ambassador changed. The Boston and Maine Railroad, which handled the train between White River Junction and Boston, bought a large fleet of self-propelled rail diesel cars. And from that point on, passengers for Boston were required to change at White River Junction, but they continued to run the Ambassador as a through train from Montreal to New York. And so that service continued, although for Boston it was less convenient. These are some pictures of it, including the then new station at Essex Junction, which remains in use, that's on the right, to this day by the Amtrak Vermonter. The crack train, as railroaders would say, the one that everyone remembered, was the Montrealer and Washingtonian, which was an overnight service which typically left Montreal somewhere between 6 and 7 in the evening, arrived in New York just at the beginning of the business day, and Washington before noon. And the beauty of that service was that a passenger could take the train to either New York or Montreal, and in fact even as far south as Philadelphia and Washington, conduct a day or at least a half a day in Washington of business, and return overnight the same day. This made the train very popular. It was always a pretty heavy handler of mail as well. But to the last day that it operated, it carried through sleeping cars to Washington, D.C. and New York. Coach passengers typically had to change in New York, but this was a very comfortable train. It's a copy of its route map. You can see it ran on the Canadian National Railway from Montreal to the U.S.-Canadian border, then on the Central Vermont Railway down to Windsor, Vermont, then on the Boston and Maine Railroad down to Springfield, Massachusetts, then on the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, the New Haven Railroad to New York City, and finally on the Pennsylvania Railroad to Washington, D.C. A remarkable number of railroads working together, and in fact, briefly before World War II, it even handled through sleeping cars in the summertime to the Mount Washington Hotel at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and you can see that little spur there run by the Maine Central Railroad that connected passengers up to that. There was food service on the Montrealer. In the evening, you could get a sandwich. If you look over on the left side of that menu, you could get a cheddar cheese sandwich or a deviled ham for 55 cents. This is a menu from 1958. At breakfast, there was a simple, what we now, I guess, call a continental. But if you wanted something more elaborate, if you look on the left panel here at the top, the attendant would actually cook up an egg for you, fried or scrambled, as well as your toast. This service was provided in a car that had 6 bedrooms in it and then a lounge and dining area. And one of the cars typically operated in the Montrealer survives to this day. It's a car called the Dover Harbor, and it belongs to the Washington, D.C. chapter of the National Railway Historical Society. And I at least once chartered it to run on the Vermonter up here to Vermont many years ago for the Smithsonian Institution. So the Montrealer and the ambassador services were long successful, but their demise was the opening of the interstate highway system in Vermont. It didn't take all of their business away, but it sucked away just enough to undermine their profitability. And that was combined with the post office removing most of the first-class mail from the American railway network. And the result was that both the Montrealer, the overnight train, and the ambassador, the day train, were discontinued on the nights of September 3rd and 4th of 1966. And that effectively ended passenger rail service in Vermont. The alternate route up through Newport, run by the Canadian Pacific north of White River Junction, had already lost service. The Boston and Maine withdrew the services from Boston up to White River Junction. When Amtrak began, there was immediate agitation to restore cross-border passenger rail services. Amtrak started operating on May the 1st, 1971. And in its initial configuration, it operated no trains on its own behalf between the United States and Canada. And very quickly, agitation began to get back a service to Canada from New York. There was a way to change trains at Buffalo and ride an RDC car to Toronto, but that wasn't actually run by Amtrak in 1971. And there was a bit of a competition between the Delaware and Hudson route over on the New York State side of Lake Champlain and the traditional Montrealer route over here on the Vermont side. And when we won in Vermont, when we won the competition, it was quite a surprise, because when Amtrak had started in 71, the overnight Montreal Limited from New York to Albany and Montreal was still running and actually still carrying quite a lot of traffic. It was discontinued despite that because it was not chosen by Amtrak as part of its original route network. But in any event, September 30th, 1972, Vermont got one of the first new routes to be added to Amtrak. What initially was called an experimental route, but it was judged a success, and it was a restoration of the Montrealer Washingtonian service, with the name Montrealer then applying in both directions. And we've got a picture of it on the right-hand side, leaving the St. Albans station, and on the left-hand side, heading in the opposite direction to the north out of St. Albans. Under Amtrak's management, the train left Montreal typically about 5:45 in the evening. It took about 2 hours to run to St. Albans, but had a long stop at St. Albans to clear U.S. Customs. Got down to New York the next morning around 7:30 or so, and finally got into Washington, D.C. shortly before noon, very close to what its traditional schedule had been. And initially, at least, it was very successful. One of its primary and loved attractions was what they called the pub lounge diner car, which provided meal service, but also for a little while actually had a piano with an entertainer on it who led sing-alongs. So that didn't last very long, but here's a picture of the pub car during the height of the Montrealer's success. Sadly, it still ran over multiple railroads. Although it was an Amtrak train, Amtrak has throughout its entire history over most of its network operated on tracks owned by the freight railroads. And in the case of the track between Windsor, Vermont and Brattleboro, the track belonged to the Boston and Maine Railroad, which had no interest in providing a quality passenger service at that time. And track conditions deteriorated to a ghastly level, so bad that ultimately Amtrak was forced actually to substitute a bus for the train between Burlington and Springfield, something which went on for almost 2 years. It devastated patronage. We lost the direct connection to Canada, and it looked like we were going to lose the train entirely. And of course, the substitute bus service did not run as a convenient businessman's overnight schedule. It ran as a daylight service. This triggered a unique event in the history of Amtrak. Amtrak's enabling legislation actually permits it to seize the trackage and rights of way of railroads that refused to maintain what Amtrak judged to be a line essential for passenger service to a standard that would allow safe passenger operations. Amtrak negotiated for over 2 years with the Guilford Transportation System, which by then had taken over the Boston and Maine, also running under the name Springfield Terminal, but they could not reach an agreement. And ultimately, Amtrak's President Graham Claytor and the powerful Vermont congressional delegation succeeded in invoking the clause of the Amtrak law that allowed Amtrak to seize the line over the disputed stretch of track and restore it to service. The Boston and Maine was granted track rights for 75 years and exclusive possession of any freight shippers that it was handling at that time. And in July of 1989, again after a slightly more than 2-year gap, we got the overnight Montrealer back. And again, the train did operationally quite well. Good loads, good passenger loads. But Amtrak throughout its history has never been adequately funded by Congress, and it has always gone from one financial crisis to another. And by the early 1990s, it was beginning to be really squeezed. And in 1994, Amtrak announced that it would no longer be able to run the Montrealer service, and it simply couldn't afford it. We tried to see if there was any alternative up here in Vermont which might permit us to continue the train. And I actually came up with the idea of effectively replacing the Montrealer with a reinstated ambassador. Although I suggested calling the train the New Englander because it would serve multiple New England states, ultimately, because Vermont decided to subsidize it, it became the Vermonter, a very appropriate name. What we basically tried to do to keep expenses within reason was to not provide sleeping car service or a fully manned dining car, but rather to offer daylight coach service with a cafe car that could be staffed by a single person, and to put it on a schedule that would allow us to take advantage of an existing Amtrak schedule between New Haven and Washington, D.C., so we would only have to pay for the cost of the train north of New Haven. And to my amazement, it worked. Governor Dean got behind the idea. One of the most interesting moments of my life was I was called down to Washington to help with the negotiations. And we had a meeting in then Republican Senator Jeffords' office. The office was staff from Democratic Socialist Congressman Bernie Sanders, Democratic Senator Pat Leahy, and Republican Senator Jim Jeffords. And we were all there simply to discuss how to get this thing to happen. And it did. And to this day, it is the accomplishment of my some 50 years of rail advocacy that I am at least personally more proud of than any other, although by no means am I the sole father of this train. The commissioner of the VTrans at the time, Pat Garahan, obviously Governor Dean, the congressional delegation, the staff at the Vermont Agency of Transportation who did the work on the operating plan, and Amtrak itself all contributed to what became a remarkable success story. The Vermonter. When Amtrak discontinued the overnight service, it looked for sure that we would lose it all. But on May 1st, 1995, we had a gap of only 1 day in service, after which we got back our train, although sadly with a bus connection initially from Montreal to St. Albans. And for those of you who can see this rather small timetable panel, you'll note that Monday through Saturday, at least initially, the bus left Montreal at 3:45 in the morning to connect to the train at St. Albans, which was departing St. Albans at 6:15 a.m. Only on Sundays was there a good departure time. Now, the bus between Montreal and St. Albans was actually a regular Vermont Transit Greyhound Line service, which we negotiated having come by the St. Albans station to handle passengers to Montreal. And sadly, that connection has been gone now for about 10 years. We are working on getting Montreal back, but that's jumping the gun a little bit on this discussion. So here's the route of the Vermonter, and if you note, the only thing missing is that piece between St. Albans and Montreal. Otherwise, it duplicates the Ambassador route and the route of the traditional Montreal or Washingtonian trains. When the original Central Vermont services were discontinued in 1966, the two trains combined were carrying about 40,000 passengers a year. Last year, in the last full year of regular service on the Vermonter carried 98,000 passengers. So we more than doubled the final ridership of the privately operated services 30 years before. And one of the things that really contributed to increasing business was that we were able to return to the traditional route of the train south of Brattleboro through Northampton and Greenfield rather than just down through Amherst and then having to actually reverse direction at Palmer, Mass to continue on to Washington. We also were very successful in attracting stimulus funds during the early years of the Obama administration, which allowed us to rebuild the entire line in the state of Vermont, so that what had been before a maximum of 55 mile per hour speed limit, now south of White River Junction, is 79 miles per hour. And north of White River Junction could be raised to that if we eventually find the money to put in trackside block signals. And that also contributed to a remarkable increase in patronage. This is a little summary sheet that the Rail Passengers Association puts out each year on Amtrak services. And this is from through 2018, we were up to about 96,700 riders, but we just barely missed 98,000 last year, before, of course, sadly, coronavirus arrived. So what remains for us is to look at ways we could make this service better. The most obvious one is to get the train back to Montreal. And this has been a goal of the Vermont Agency of Transportation for many years. We have negotiated, in fact, a new treaty with Canada, which will permit customs and immigration formalities for both countries to be conducted in Central Station in Montreal. This is not at all without precedent. That's been going on actually for over 15 years in Vancouver, British Columbia, with the Seattle to Vancouver trains, and it's been going on in the airports in Canada for flights into US cities for a similar period of time. But historically, the trains stopped at the border. If you were a passenger today on the Adirondack train, when it was still running across the border before the border closed, but if you were a passenger from Plattsburgh, for example, to Montreal, the train would stop at a place called Cantic, Quebec, which appears just to be a small shack out in the middle of a field. But it's just across the border by about a mile, and it's where Canadian Customs Immigration get aboard to clear passengers going up to Montreal. And the train sits there for close to an hour while customs is conducted. And if someone isn't liked, if the Canadians don't want them to enter their country, they're put in a taxi and immediately returned to the United States. Conversely, leaving Montreal, the train stops for an hour to an hour and 45 minutes at Rouse's Point, New York, for U.S. Customs. And this has the effect not only of being very annoying because you've just gotten into your seat and now you have to get up again and talk to the customs agents, potentially open up your luggage, etc., but it also causes the train schedule to be typically 60 to 90 minutes longer than it needs to be before reaching Montreal or after leaving Montreal. If those formalities could be conducted in Central Station, we could get at least an hour out of the typical running time that would be possible today with customs not in the station. So we've been looking at services to Montreal again from New England for quite a few years. And again, an Obama stimulus-funded study has concluded that the most practical way to do it is to go from Boston to Springfield and then north over the existing route to Montreal. And in just a moment, I'll point out the obvious unfortunate nature of that routing, but it was chosen because, quite frankly, it's the only routing that still has track on it. The more logical one, which you might think we ought to do, which would be to go from Boston up through Concord to White River Junction and then up to Montreal, was sadly torn up about 1986, and north of Concord to White River Junction now is a bike trail. It doesn't say it couldn't be restored, but it would be incredibly controversial. And there is one advantage, at least, of going from Boston over to Springfield, which is that it would allow the development of an internal corridor within the state of Massachusetts between those major cities, something that certainly is needed. So where do we stand on getting back to Montreal? We've run a test train. We have negotiated the treaty. What needs to be done now is to construct the secure holding facility in Montreal and potentially to do a bit of track work north of the US-Canadian border. From the border for about 6 miles up to Cantic, there's still jointed rail, which would be better replaced by welded rail. But basically, the project should be able to move forward fairly quickly once it's identified how the two countries are going to fund it. There is, however, an irony in this, which is that the train that's going to go to Montreal from New York, the Vermonter, has a rather circuitous route. It goes to New Haven and then up, whereas the more direct Ethan Allen Express, once it reaches Burlington, could also go on to Montreal and provide Burlington and Middlebury with same-day travel from Canada. But to do it, we need to fix about 7 miles of track from Burlington Union Station over to Essex Junction, which currently is used only by freight trains and over which trains can run only at 10 miles per hour. Now, I make reference to the abortive commuter rail service that was tried in the early 2000s between Charlotte and Burlington, because that piece of bad track beyond Burlington to Essex Junction was also the flaw that basically killed our attempt to experiment with commuter rail service. The largest single demand point for travel by rail was the then IBM plant in Essex Junction. But if you were going to it on the commuter train that was running from Charlotte to Burlington, you had to change to a bus in Burlington, and it was another half hour out to IBM, which obviously no one much wanted to do. And as things stand now, we have actually completed a complete reconstruction of the railway route from Rutland to Burlington to 59-mile-per-hour passenger standards and what could be 79-mile-per-hour standards if we put in signals. And we've completely rebuilt the line from the Canadian border down to Springfield. But we've got a 7-mile gap, which effectively creates two completely distinct networks in the state of Vermont for passenger rail. One that ends at Burlington and one only 7 miles away in Essex Junction, which, if we fixed that track, would, for example, allow direct Burlington-Montreal service, or perhaps Burlington-Montpelier-Barrie service, or perhaps St. Albans to Burlington service. So many other possibilities would open up to us if we made that repair. And that needs to be one of the primary priorities of the state of Vermont, in my view, in our next 5-year rail plan. We do have 2 trains. We've spent most of our time talking about the Vermonter, but Rutland, which lost passenger service in 1953, got it back in 1996 thanks to the good work of Senator Jeffords. It got it back in the form of a train called the Ethan Allen Express, which runs from New York to Albany, up through Saratoga Springs and the Lake George area, served at a place called Fort Edward, to Whitehall, New York, and then over to Rutland. And starting the fall of next year, we'll hopefully serve Burlington. This is the lovely station that was built in Rutland for that train. Passenger train service between Whitehall, New York and Rutland ended in 1937 and was restored 59 years later when the Ethan Allen arrived. And when we get that train up to Burlington, it will restore a service that was lost in 1953. And this speaks to the wisdom of leaving the track in place. If, as you did from White River Junction down to Concord, New Hampshire, you take the track up and you want to restore it, it's vastly more complicated than if you just want to come in and do track upgrading, which is what we did between Rutland and Burlington. And there are other examples of successful passenger rail in New England. If I could point a single flaw out of the services that we have up here in Vermont, it is that they only run once a day. And so, for example, on the Vermonter, if you take the train down to New York, or you will take it hopefully by a year or so from now up to Montreal, you're going to arrive late in the evening, which means if you want to do any sightseeing or business, you need at least 2 nights in a hotel to do it. If we had more frequencies, if we restored, for example, the overnight Montrealer, you could go down for the day and back by sleeping on board the train overnight. In New England, over by Boston, between Boston, Portland, and Brunswick, Maine, Amtrak's most successful new service in the eastern United States is the Downeaster, which restored a service that gradually unraveled in the 1960s, but was once really quite exceptional. In 1937, the Boston and Maine took delivery of a small streamliner from the Budd Company, which could make speeds of 110 miles an hour. They called it the Flying Yankee, and it was fast. Ironically, it was so fast that it sort of overwhelmed its own ridership capabilities because it was a fixed consist train. They couldn't add cars to it, and it was replaced by a traditional locomotive-hauled train after only about 3 or 4 years on its original route. It ran for decades in New England, but it operated as replacement services on secondary lines. So this is a good example of a 1955 Boston and Maine schedule between Boston, Portland, and on up to Bangor. And there's at least 3 trains a day running up to Rockland in this timetable. But this unraveled quickly. And again, the story of the unravelment was the opening of the I-95 and New Hampshire and Maine turnpikes, which again sucked off probably about 40% of the ridership. And then at the beginning of the 1960s, the loss of mail contracts. The Boston and Maine tried to stay in. They bought a new fleet of streamlined trains just after World War II, and they even tried a tilt train called a Talgo, Spanish design. Unfortunately, the track was pretty rough between Boston and Portland, and the Talgo made literally only 1 round trip from Boston to Portland. Everybody on board got mildly seasick, And thereafter, it was assigned as a commuter train to the Boston-Salem Rockland line primarily, and never made a long-distance run again, although 30 years later, Amtrak bought Talgo trains and runs them in the Pacific Northwest on much better track. Instead, the Boston and Maine made a massive investment in self-propelled rail diesel cars. These look like coaches, but actually they have a diesel locomotive in them. And the ingenuity of the design is that, for example, the 3-car train you see over on the right could split at a place like White River Junction. 2 of the cars could go up to Newport, 1 could perhaps go up to Berlin. And in fact, exactly that sort of thing went on for decades. The Boston and Maine owned the largest fleet of these cars in the world. At their peak, they had 109 of them. They replaced all the commuter trains out of North Station in Boston, and they also replaced almost all of the Boston and Maine's intercity trains, except the Ambassador and the Montrealer. They were operationally completely successful, but they also arrived, once again, just about as the interstate highway system was opening, as the mail contracts were being lost, and the railway brotherhoods would not agree to the kind of reduced crews that would have really made them pay off. And although the Boston and Maine had that huge fleet, by 1966, their services had shrunk back to just commuter trains out of Boston. Now, Amtrak restarted service to Portland after a 36-year gap from Boston in 2001. Initially with only 4 trains a day. More recently, it's climbed to 5 trains a day, before Corona at least. And ridership remarkably exploded. There are multimodal connections at Portland to all of northern Maine. And the train itself has been extended to Brunswick and soon probably to Rockland, at least in the summer on weekends. Ridership by the end of 2018 had grown to 535,000 riders. Now, think about this for just a moment. We have 1 single round trip a day of the Vermonter, and we were up to around 98,000 riders. Ridership follows convenience. The Downeasters, by running 5 times a day, allowed you to take a day trip to either Boston or Portland or to any of the stops along the line. And not surprisingly, they've just about got 5 times our ridership and only slightly more than our subsidy, where Vermont pays Amtrak around $8 million a year to operate its services. The main services cost typically only around $12 to $13 million a year, even though there are 5 trains instead of the 2 that we have, if you count the Ethan Allen as well. Maine is considering very strongly extending this service from Brunswick to Rockland. For about 10 years, there actually was tourist train service run by the Maine Eastern Railroad over that line, but that ended 3 years ago. And now the plan is to actually have the Downeaster trains, at least on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday in the summer, continue on at least possibly 2 or 3 of the 5 daily trips to Rockland in high summer. Further south, service has resumed in a really serious way between Springfield and New Haven, with some of the trains being run by Amtrak and some by Connecticut DOT called CT Rail. This is the most successful new commuter rail start in the eastern United States, probably in the last 40 or 50 years. It is carrying hundreds of thousands of riders per year. In addition, Massachusetts, at least pre-corona, had paid to extend 2 of those trains from Greenfield to Springfield, being run by Amtrak. And this actually produces, in a small way, a shadow of one of the ideas that I'm supporting, which is that we ought to have, even if we don't get back the overnight sleeping car train all the way, we ought to have one of these services originate in White River Junction, not Greenfield, and allow riders in southern Vermont, at least, to be able to get down to New York City prior to noon and have a day of business in the city and come back in the evening. Even during the coronavirus plague, one of these 2 additional round trips out of Greenfield has continued running. And at the moment, the Valley Flyer from Greenfield down to Springfield and New Haven, with a cross-platform transfer at New Haven for Amtrak to Washington or for Metro North trains to Grand Central Station, New York, the Valley Flyer is the only service running on the Vermonter line north of Springfield at present because of coronavirus. But there might be another way to do this, and that, ironically, is to go back to the rail diesel cars, which cost a fraction of the fuel expense of locomotive-hauled trains and could be run by a crew of just an engineer and a conductor. And these cars are by no means gone. All Earth Rail in Vermont, a company that David Blittersdorf founded, has 12 of these cars ready to go, actually operational, that it acquired back from a commuter rail service down in Texas, and in the case of 2 cars from sources up in Canada. And these are the same Bud cars that actually ran historically back in the 1950s and 60s up here in northern New England. They remain practical, they remain efficient, they remain comfortable, and they could very well be used. And so we could think about some bigger ideas. What about some trains on the line north of Springfield that were timed properly to commute for a day into Springfield? If I flashed you back to that schedule of the Valley Flyer, you would see that oddly, the Valley Flyer trains do not permit commuters in the Pioneer Valley to actually go to Greenfield or Hartford for same-day commuting. There is no train, as we mentioned earlier, from White River Junction down to Springfield, New Haven, that allows Vermonters to get to New York City for the day, or for that matter, down to the lower Pioneer Valley and back for the same day. And Massachusetts could obviously profit from, and there is very significant interest in Massachusetts right now, in having service from Boston that goes further west than Fitchburg or Worcester, which at the moment are the western limitations of commuter rail service out of Boston. Even a single train a day that went into Boston in the morning from Springfield and back out in the evening would obviously be well used. But one of the ironies of the Vermonter is that it barely misses an Amtrak train at Springfield from Boston in the northbound direction. Southbound, you can actually connect, although there's a ridiculous 2-hour layover. But what if there were 3 or 4 trains a day between Springfield and Boston and good connections were reestablished? Or what if we got service back west of Fitchburg to Greenfield and riders from Vermont could connect to North Station at Greenfield, which would actually get them to Boston probably an hour and a half faster than going all the way down to Springfield? What if? What if? These tracks exist and they are already in pretty good condition. What if? Look at the Lakeshore Limited west of Worcester, going through western Massachusetts. So could we go back to the future? We already have the RDC cars, but if we wanted new equipment, on the right is an example of a European design diesel multiple unit, which is basically just the modern name for a rail diesel car. This particular train was on the A train down north of Dallas, Texas, but the Dallas area is just open and significant new routes powered that way. One of the criticisms is, could Bud cars run through the mountains? These are pictures of the British Columbia Railways RDC car operation up in northern British Columbia, which for decades ran 700 miles north from Vancouver up in northern British Columbia through one of the most stupendous and snow-capped mountain ranges in the world, with 98% availability and reliability throughout its history. 1955 schedule from Boston out to Greenfield and Troy, New York. This was the Minuteman route of the Boston and Maine. It remains in place all the way, except oddly enough, the short branch from Johnsonville into Troy, and could easily have service restored from Boston to Greenfield, which would connect to Vermont. Sadly, again, because the line directly up to White River Junction and the slightly less direct, but still more direct than what survives line that went through Keene, both of those are gone. Here's a train set on TexRail, a new operation out of Fort Worth in Texas up to Grapevine, Texas. These trains meet all U.S. crash safety standards. They're actually Swiss designed, modern DMUs. Tourist railroads could even play in the game. I showed you a few minutes ago an example of the trains that ran for a few years between Brunswick, Maine and Rockland. The Vermont rail system itself operated Green Mountain Flyer trains out of Bellows Falls and White River Junction that on paper could have connected to Amtrak, although the schedules never did. The Saratoga North Creek ran trains from Saratoga Springs, New York up to North Creek, New York for 4 or 5 years, although regrettably they only connected to the Ethan Allen Express in the southbound direction only. Here's an example of one of the Green Mountain Flyer trains going under the I-91 bridge at Bellows Falls, about 5 minutes away from the joint station with Amtrak. If this service was coordinated with Amtrak, skiers could go directly to the Okemo Mountain on this train. Just as an example, there's a stop that's within walkable distance of the base up at Okemo. The Valley Railroad down in Connecticut, which runs steam trains, actually has track directly into the old Saybrook station. And while it does not coordinate its schedules with Amtrak, it could. It goes up as far as Haddam and is actually in place all the way back to Hartford, although it hasn't been used north of there for 40 years or more. But this is another example of a line that could be coordinated for real passenger rail service. So the Vermonter gives us some consequential lessons about the future of passenger rail up here in northern New England. Regional rail can work. If the coronavirus had not struck, we would have easily topped 100,000 riders. Frequency matters. When we moved the line over to Greenfield and when we added the Valley Flyer services, patronage increased dramatically on the Vermonter line. The Ethan Allen Express, when it reaches Burlington directly, will offer Amtrak riders in northern Vermont an hour and a half faster service down to New York than the existing route. The Vermonter itself might be flipped back over to provide an overnight schedule and give us 2 trains to New York on different schedules without actually having to add an additional frequency. But there are also negative lessons that we need to learn from our experience. Connections matter. The Vermonter on paper crosses other Amtrak routes at Springfield, at New Haven, at New York, at Philadelphia, and at Washington, but at virtually all of those points, it makes no meaningful connections because the schedules have not been properly coordinated. I mentioned the example of what happens at Springfield when the Boston to Springfield train misses the Vermont train by about 10 minutes. The same thing happens coming down from Vermont if you wanted to go to Albany. The Vermont trains do not connect to the Florida services of Amtrak, even though there is a substantial demand for service from Vermont to Florida. And we have a vast network of state-supported buses up here in Vermont, yet ironically, practically none of our rail services connect to the state-subsidized bus services. One of the ones that does is a service called the Shires of Vermont Connector, which VTrans provides as what is officially called an Ambus from Manchester and Bennington to the Albany Amtrak station. This is also suspended because of coronavirus, but until the coronavirus suspension, this service was the single example of a fully integrated bus rail operation of this sort, other than a winter-only service up to Killington from Rutland. But the Vermont Shires Connector does not appear in the Ethan Allen Express timetable. It does not appear in the Amtrak New York Albany Buffalo timetable, and it does not appear in the Vermonter timetable. So an intending rider actually has to guess that this service might exist. If you go into the Amtrak computer and you ask for Manchester to New York, you'll get it. But if you look even on an Amtrak map, there's no indication this service even exists. And this has gone on for 4 or 5 years. This is a simple thing that we just can't seem to get straight or get right. Rail is always something that is argued over in this country. We say we invest in highways and we subsidize rail. But all my career, I've asked people, when did you last get a dividend check from I-89? We invest in both in truth. The highways don't even come close to paying for themselves, and the difference is made up out of direct tax revenue, as is rail. And if you lose something completely, it's very hard to get it back. Here we have a picture of the wonderful bridge across the Hudson, the ultimate bike trail probably in the eastern United States. It's a nearly 2-mile-long bridge that the Haven Railroad constructed across the Hudson River to bypass the congestion of New York City in the late 19th century, and which was used until about 1976 when there was a minor fire on the bridge and service was suspended. This now is, again, an elaborate bike trail. Goes for many, many miles on both sides of the Hudson River, but it is lost as a rail bypass around New York City. And the nearest point where freight rail can bypass the city of New York now is virtually up to Albany at Selkirk, New York. A much closer example was that line directly north from Burlington to Montreal out over the islands that we opened up with. If we had had the foresight when we took over the Rutland Railway network from its bankruptcy in 1963, we would have had a route to Montreal that was about 20 miles shorter than the present route, but more importantly, was engineered straight as an arrow and could have operated trains at substantial speeds, and probably again would have gotten a train from Burlington to Montreal at least an hour and possibly even more faster than what we'll be capable of doing eventually through Essex Junction. We're not going to see this restored. There's no way I think that the magnificent bike path across the islands is going to be taken back over, but it was a lack of foresight and a real loss. And it's a lesson in the value of holding on to what you have. Now, at the moment, and this is the end of the formal presentation, we also have, of course, lost all of the trains up here to coronavirus. And I am strongly hopeful that we will see them back, potentially as early as the end of the year, although I think it is probably more likely around the February holidays. They have been suspended because, in the view of the state government, and I support them on this, we have too much coronavirus to the south of us to feel safe about having those riders coming up into Vermont. And now, sadly, recently, I have to agree that we also have seen enough of a resurgence in Vermont that we need to be cautious. There is, in truth, very little evidence that Amtrak itself has served as a major conveyor of the virus. But the problem is it takes only one incident for something like that to happen. Amtrak is providing a very high level of cleanliness. It is selling only half of its seats, which means if you book a seat on an Amtrak train that is still running, and the closest ones to us are at Albany or Greenfield, you will get 2 seats. The air on board an Amtrak train changes over every 5 to 6 minutes. The legroom between seats is double what it is typically on a bus or a plane. The pitch of the seats, the recline degree to which the seats recline, is vastly more comfortable. But the trains themselves are safe. They are also enforcing mask requirements. So we will hope that we can look to a restoration sooner rather than later. A positive note is that Vermont has continued to do aggressive work on improving the rail network, even during the virus. This summer, VTrans completed a new tunnel under downtown Middlebury, which will permit the construction of a new Middlebury passenger station beginning in the spring. This summer, Vermont constructed a magnificent new station in Vergennes and Ferrisburg that actually is the old historic Vergennes station, moved about a quarter-mile north from its historic location and completely rebuilt. And it will be what I bitched about earlier, a properly designed multimodal station with a bus arrival on one side of the station, the train on the other. The historic building has been restored. It has been air-conditioned. A large park and ride has been built with it. That work has continued. Work has begun at Burlington Union Station to create a new platform that will allow handicapped passengers to easily board the train at Burlington. And work will begin in the spring to enlarge the Burlington yards to store and service the Ethan Allen train overnight. So we have not backed away from rail. We have continued to support it. But again, I leave us with these enticing views of what might have been if there had been a bit more foresight 50-some years ago. We could have had a much more productive route to get to Montreal and perhaps for regional service into Burlington and through Burlington. Keep what you have, treasure what you have, improve it, and use it. And finally, I'll close with the last stanzas of Edna St. Vincent Millay's poem about train travel. I love Millay, and she wrote a wonderful sonnet about train travel, which ends with, "My heart is warm tonight with friends I'll meet, and better friends I'll not be knowing, and there isn't a train I wouldn't take, no matter where it's going." Thank you, folks, and now I'd love to take some questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Carl, for that extremely informative presentation. So we have a few questions right away, so I'm going to jump into them right now.
Yep.
So a few of them are just about simple questions of certain routes. So the first one is, does the Vermonter go to Montreal?
Not yet. And it doesn't have a bus connection at present either. I have been trying to get the bus connection restored because that could be done instantly, but I've not been successful on that. But I would guess, if I was to be a betting man, that we will see service to Montreal in about 2 years. There does need again to be some track work north of the border up to Kantic, and more importantly, there needs to be the construction of the customs and immigration facility in Central Station. And one of the ironies is both Canada and the US would like to sort of pass the ball to the other side. The US view is we're going to bring all this tourism benefit into Montreal, so Montreal should pay for the costs. The Canadian view is we're not getting any local traffic in Canada out of this because we can't make stops in Canada, and why should we be supporting going to the US? The answer seems Solomonic. Cut it right in the middle, 50-50, but it remains under negotiation. VTrans has former Commissioner of Transportation Brian Searles working on it, and he has been doing really good work on it. And this is not a project that is failing. We've got the treaty's been signed. It's a matter of getting that work done. Then the train could go tomorrow.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. So the next one is, what is your opinion on the impact of border crossing delays due to immigration on limiting service, ultimately cutting it out? How critical is getting back to Montreal for future passenger increases? I know you talked a little bit about this.
It's incredibly important. We've got 4 million people living basically 60 miles north of St. Albans, 80 miles north of Burlington, and right now, at least, we can't get there. In the summer, in theory, you could take the ferry across the lake to Port Kent, New York, and board the Adirondack there. But the Burlington-Port Kent ferry line has been dropped down only 4 round trips a day, and its season has been dramatically shortened. And in addition, with the border closed, of course, the Adirondack isn't operating north of Albany either. So that's not there. We definitely need service. It would be of a tremendous benefit to the state of New York. But one of the reasons that I pushed so hard last year and continue to push to get the Burlington-Essex branch line track upgraded is I don't want to see the Ethan Allen terminating indefinitely Burlington. I want to see it go to Montreal. The problem now is when we get the Vermonter up to Montreal, Montrealese will be able to come down to Essex Junction, but if their real destination is Burlington, they're going to have to get on a bus at Essex Junction and go on downtown. Now, that exists. That's actually one place where the bus does run from the railroad station, although you have to buy a separate ticket, but it takes 30 to 40 minutes. If the train went through, it would be about a 12 to 15-minute run from Essex Junction to Burlington, and we'd have a market of 4 million people who potentially could benefit in Burlington. On a typical summer day and at normal times in Burlington, hundreds of Montrealese, Quebecois come down every day into northern Vermont. And that's a market we're squandering. And if I had my brothers, like little Abner used to say, I would have one train run by day from Montreal to New York, which would be the Ethan Allen, and I'd have the other run by night, which would be the Vermonter, and would once again restore the ability for Vermonters to go to Montreal for the day and for Vermonters to go to New York for the day. And I would do it that way. But again, that's a couple of years away. But it is absolutely true that the Canadian border will, I think, revolutionize our patronage when we can finally cross it again.
Definitely. And the next one is about widening the portions of the track. So are there any efforts to widen the portions of the track that have rock faces close to the train, which limits speed to 5 miles an hour, or
yes.
in turn
Yes. Vermont got a grant from the United States Department of Transportation to work on Rockslide Mitigation, and that has been happening all along the line. If we were still able to run the Vermonter right now, if the coronavirus had intervened, the number of speed restrictions that were imposed based on that problem has been dramatically reduced. However, ultimately, to get speeds up to 80 miles an hour, we need to put what are called block signals in north of White River Junction to the Canadian border. And that probably is hundreds of thousands of dollars per mile, but ultimately it would be of great benefit to both freight and passenger service. In the shorter term, railroads have something called slide detecting fences, which look sort of like chain link fences running on the side of a rocky slope. But if it's rock slide comes down and a rock strikes one of those fences, it would cause either a signal or an indication through a satellite system to the cab of a locomotive, tell the engineer that there was a potential problem up ahead, and then the train could slow down to watch for it or stop and check the track. Slide detection fences is not rocket science. There are hundreds and hundreds of miles of those all over the United States. And we're going to begin installing some of those probably in Vermont as well to deal with some of the slide mitigation issues. Widening the track isn't so much the issue, it's getting the rock slide areas either pushed back or getting mitigation factors like slide detecting fences. It would even be possible, for example, to put up a limited number of block signals. Instead of having one, say, every mile or two along the line, you could have what railroaders call absolute blocks between passing tracks. Passing tracks might be every 10 miles or so apart, but once you got into a block, there'd be signals at each passing track, you'd have authority to go on to the next one. And if slide detection fence was in the way, there would probably be an intermediate signal that would indicate the status of the rock slide. That, again, remains unfunded, but it's something that we will be needing to work on in the next 10 years or so.
Well, thank you for that. That was our last question. So I just want to thank you again for that presentation. It was extremely informative, and also just so interesting. So thank you so much.
Let me throw a final note in. I may be calling on all of the listeners of this program to help me with some advocacy to get the Vermonter back when it's clear that the pandemic is beginning to decline along the line. This is not because VTrans would be opposing it necessarily, but it is to tell them that the demand is really out there. A month or so ago, I got a remarkable interaction with one gentleman who's physically handicapped, who can't drive any longer, who uses the train to go see his relatives. And there are other people I know who use the train to get to the VA hospital in White River Junction. There are people who have used it to get down to the Brattleboro Retreat for treatment. At least anecdotally, I believe there is one person up here in the Essex Junction area who has been spending $300 once a month or so for Uber to get down to the Brattleboro area for medical treatments because there is no replacement bus service available either. It is not right now possible, for me at least, to make an immediate demand for a restoration of service. But hopefully as we get into the new year, if a vaccine comes along, if we see the situation with coronavirus improving dramatically all along down the line, we need our political advocates, our leaders, to see the value of the train, and to try to bring them back as soon as we reasonably can. And at that point, again, I may ask for Sustainable Transport Vermont to give me a little help with friendly letters to our governor, as we asked for a month or two ago, and we hoped we could have it by Thanksgiving, but that was, of course, sadly before it exploded. But by no means have I abandoned that hope. And I hope those of you who support rail service will stand with us as we try to see not only our services restored, but really dramatically improved.
Absolutely. Definitely send us any information and we can share it on the Facebook page as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you for the invite.
Of course. We hope to have you back. So thank you for everyone who came and watched, and we'll see you next Friday.
Good day.